The late afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban streets. The hum of daily life seemed to settle into a rhythmic calm, interrupted only by the occasional honking of horns or the distant chatter of people heading home after work. It was just another ordinary day in the city, where the usual buzz of activities slowly faded into the peaceful quiet of dusk. Judge Angela Hayes had just finished a long, demanding day at court, having presided over a case that had made national headlines. Her ruling had been praised for its fairness and its bold stance on justice, bringing both criticism and admiration. But none of that mattered to her at the moment. She was simply looking forward to some peace and quiet at home. Her mind was still buzzing with the intricacies of the case, but she drove through the neighborhood with a sense of relief, eager to put the demands of her profession behind her for the day. Angela was a highly respected figure in the judicial system, known for her strong sense of integrity and her unwavering commitment to equality. As the first black female judge in her district, she had worked tirelessly to break down barriers and create a more just society. She had earned her position through years of dedication, rising through the ranks to earn the seat that she now held with honor. Her every decision, every ruling, carried weight, and she wore that responsibility with grace. As she navigated the streets, her luxury car, an old but well-maintained vehicle, moved smoothly, the purr of the engine providing a soothing soundtrack to her thoughts. She could see her house up ahead, its warm lights shining through the windows, signaling the end of another challenging but successful day. She had a cup of tea waiting for her, the quiet comfort of her home beckoning her. But as she passed a small corner street, something caught her attention. In her rearview mirror, she saw a police patrol car pull behind her, flashing its lights. Judge Hayes frowned. She hadn't done anything wrong. There were no red lights, no stop signs she had run, no reason for a traffic stop. But the officer's lights were persistent, their bright glow reflecting off the rearview mirror. She slowly eased her car to the side of the street and came to a gentle stop, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Officer Mark Reynolds, a young and brash patrol officer, was on duty, frustrated and tired after a long shift. He had been dealing with a series of difficult calls all day, and his mood had soured further as the afternoon had gone on. He'd been trying to get his hands on something significant for weeks, but things always seemed to fall short. Today, though, he had a gut feeling that he could catch someone out of line. As he cruised down the street, his eyes caught the glint of a luxury vehicle, an expensive car being driven by a black woman. He immediately felt a suspicion stir in him, though he couldn't quite place why. Something about the car, the situation, it didn't sit right with him. Without thinking twice, he decided to pull the vehicle over. It wasn't an uncommon tactic for him. The officer had a history of making assumptions based on appearances, and his record reflected some of his more questionable decisions. With his hand on his flashlight, Reynolds made his way to the car, a simmering impatience rising within him. As he approached the vehicle, he noted the woman's calm demeanor, but it didn't stop him from continuing with the stop. He glanced at her face, and, noticing her official-looking attire, his suspicion deepened. This was an opportunity to assert control, to question authority. His internal bias, something that had quietly stewed beneath the surface, told him that he needed to make his point. But little did he know, the woman sitting behind the wheel was about to turn his world upside down. As Officer Mark Reynolds stepped up to the driver's side window, he took a deep breath, adjusting the grip on his flashlight. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. The hum of city traffic buzzed around him, but he focused only on the woman in the luxury car. He was determined to assert himself, as if he had something to prove. The woman, dressed in formal judicial robes, did not seem to match the image he had created in his head of someone in such an expensive vehicle. Reynolds knocked firmly on the window, his stance broad and imposing, as he motioned for Judge Hayes to lower it. She complied, rolling it down slowly, keeping her calm demeanor intact. "Good evening, officer," Judge Hayes greeted, her voice steady and professional. "Can I help you?" Reynolds didn't respond with the usual polite greeting that many officers did. Instead, his words came out sharper than expected. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "And why are you driving such a nice car? This isn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect someone like you to be." Judge Hayes's eyebrows arched slightly in surprise at the implication. She had been pulled over before, but never with such an overtly hostile approach. Still, she kept her composure, knowing that any emotional reaction could escalate the situation. "I'm just returning home, officer," she replied calmly, pointing to her neighborhood ahead. "I'm not sure why you're questioning my presence here. I live around the corner." Her tone was polite, though there was an underlying firmness in her words. She was no stranger to being treated unfairly, but she had learned over the years that keeping her composure often helped diffuse volatile situations. But Officer Reynolds wasn't listening. His expression had hardened, and he was now squinting as if trying to find some reason, any reason, to justify his actions. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for her to hear. "You're driving a car like that, and I'm supposed to believe you live around here? Something doesn't add up." Judge Hayes's patience was starting to wear thin, but she kept her voice even. "I assure you, officer, everything adds up. Now, could you kindly explain to me why I've been pulled over? I've done nothing wrong." Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back and scanned the car, as if searching for any excuse to justify his suspicion. "I think you know exactly why," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's not like I've never seen this before. You know what they say, driving while black." Judge Hayes froze for a moment, her heart pounding slightly at the audacity of the accusation. She had heard that phrase too many times before, driving while black. But hearing it from an officer made her blood run cold. The officer was accusing her of being a threat, simply based on the color of her skin. It wasn't the first time she had experienced such prejudice, but it was the first time it had been so boldly stated in such a setting. "Officer," she said slowly, her voice filled with quiet authority, "I am a judge. I've been serving in this community for years. I'm afraid you're mistaken if you believe I am doing anything wrong." Reynolds' face twitched, disbelief creeping into his expression. "A judge?" he sneered. "I don't believe you." He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting confirmation from another officer, though he was alone. The situation was rapidly escalating. Passers-by had begun to notice, and a few people had started pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. Judge Hayes could feel the tension in the air, but she refused to let herself be provoked. It was clear that this officer, operating under the influence of bias and unchecked power, was trying to provoke her into a reaction. But she wasn't about to play along. "Yes, officer." "A judge," she said firmly, now showing him her judicial identification. "I've earned that title through years of hard work and dedication to the law. My profession is a matter of public record." Reynolds, however, was not prepared to let go of his assumptions. "I don't care what you say. There's no way a judge would be driving through here. What's your real story?" He was digging himself deeper, his frustration growing as he tried to salvage his actions with baseless accusations. Judge Hayes remained calm, but her gaze hardened. "Officer," she said, her tone cool but pointed, "you've made an error here, and I suggest you rectify it before this gets out of hand. There are consequences to treating people unfairly, and I would suggest you start by looking at your own biases." The officer's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, but he wasn't done. His need to exert control was overpowering. He had no intention of backing down, not even when faced with the truth. But Judge Hayes was done. She could feel the eyes of those watching her, and she knew she had to take control of the situation before things escalated any further. "You've made a mistake," she said again, more forcefully this time, "and I expect you to admit it before you go any further." The silence between them grew heavy, and the officer's uncertainty became clear. He had overstepped, and now he had nowhere to hide. But Judge Hayes wasn't finished. "I will be filing a formal complaint about this encounter," she added, "and I assure you this won't be the last time you hear from me." As the tension between Judge Hayes and Officer Reynolds escalated, more people gathered, drawn by the growing commotion. Passers-by slowed their steps, sensing something was wrong, and some even stopped to watch the exchange unfold. A few people, recognizing Judge Hayes, whispered to one another, their phones already out and recording the incident. The sound of cameras clicking and phones capturing the scene made the air feel heavier, and Judge Hayes knew that this was no longer just a personal encounter. It had become a public spectacle. Despite the increasing crowd, Judge Hayes kept her composure, refusing to let the officers' escalating hostility dictate her actions. She was a judge, accustomed to conflict and high-pressure situations, and this was no different. But as the situation continued to spiral, the officer grew more flustered and desperate. His body language was becoming increasingly aggressive, and it was clear that he felt challenged in front of the growing crowd. "You need to step out of the car now!" Officer Reynolds barked, his voice sharp. "I'm giving you a direct order, and if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for resisting an officer." Judge Hayes, though still seated in her car, was unfazed by the threat. She raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but stern. "Arrest me for what exactly, officer?" she asked. "You've stopped me without cause, and you're threatening me based solely on the color of my skin." Reynolds' face flushed a deep red as his frustration mounted. "You're obstructing justice," he spat, a note of panic in his voice. He was now reaching for his handcuffs, as if the physical act of cuffing her would somehow reassert his control over the situation. His hand hovered over his belt, but his movements seemed unsure, driven by anger rather than any real legal reasoning. The crowd, now fully aware of what was happening, shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring among themselves. A few people stepped forward, calling out in disbelief. "What's going on? Why are you treating her like this?" one man asked. "That's Judge Hayes. She's a respected official." The officer's grip on the handcuffs tightened, but he still hesitated. It was as though a growing sense of uncertainty was beginning to seep in. The realization that he might have made a grave mistake was starting to settle in, but his pride and need to control the situation held him back from backing down. He needed to regain dominance, to silence those who were questioning his authority. Judge Hayes could see the officer's inner turmoil, the confusion and anger battling within him. She also noticed that the crowd's growing support for her was adding to his anxiety. But instead of letting the moment turn into a volatile confrontation, she chose to continue to address him with calm but unyielding authority. "Officer, you are out of line," she said, her voice firm yet measured. "You have no legal reason to demand I step out of my vehicle, and I will not allow you to escalate this further based on assumptions and biases. I am a public servant just as much as you are, and I expect to be treated with respect." As she spoke, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, and several onlookers, now realizing the gravity of the situation, began to speak up. "You can't treat people like this." One woman yelled from the sidewalk, "She's a judge. She has the right to be here." The calls for justice and fairness grew, amplifying the pressure on Officer Reynolds. At that moment, Judge Hayes made her final move. She lowered her window slightly more and, with measured calm, informed the officer, "I am filing a formal complaint for your misconduct today. You will answer for this." The officer's hand, still hovering over the handcuffs, faltered. He looked at her, uncertainty in his eyes. The voices from the crowd, the weight of the situation, and the fear of the consequences now hanging over him, made his decision even harder. As Judge Hayes calmly stepped out of her car, the crowd's murmurs quieted, the tension thick in the air. She stood tall and composed, her judicial robe flowing as she reached inside her coat pocket. In one smooth motion, she pulled out her badge, revealing it to Officer Reynolds and the growing crowd. "I am Judge Angela Hayes, sitting on the state's highest court," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've stopped me without cause, and I expect an explanation for this interaction. I challenge you to explain your actions, especially given my position and the authority it carries." The crowd gasped, some whispering in disbelief while others pulled out their phones to capture the dramatic moment. They had witnessed the unjust treatment of a powerful public servant, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Judge Hayes's steady presence in the face of such aggression was a testament to her integrity, and it was clear that Officer Reynolds was not prepared for what came next. But instead of immediately acknowledging his error, Reynolds' reaction was one of denial and defensiveness. His face flushed crimson as he squared his shoulders, the initial shock of her revelation fading into hostility. "That's not possible," he shot back, his voice trembling with the weight of his own stubbornness. "You're lying. No judge would be driving around like this. You must be making it up." The crowd fell silent, the tension thickening. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. The officer's refusal to recognize her authority, even after she revealed her identity, was nothing short of absurd. Judge Hayes, unfazed by his blatant disregard for the truth, stood her ground. "You've already made assumptions based on my race, and now you're questioning my identity as a judge," she said, her voice calm but laced with steely conviction. "That's not just a problem. That's a violation of my rights and the very principles you're supposed to uphold." As the situation escalated, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. Backup officers arrived at the scene, having been called in due to the growing crowd and the heightened situation. They immediately assessed the scene, their eyes shifting between Reynolds and Judge Hayes. There was no denying the gravity of the moment, and the officers could tell that this wasn't going to end well for their colleague. The officer, still clutching his radio and trying to maintain control of the situation, knew he was backed into a corner. The support for Judge Hayes from the crowd and the unwavering confidence she displayed were undeniable. Judge Hayes took a deep breath, her poised stance commanding the attention of the entire scene. She knew the gravity of the situation not just for herself, but for the countless individuals who had suffered similar injustices. With calm authority, she began to speak, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her words sharp but measured, "you've displayed not only a complete disregard for the law, but also a blatant demonstration of prejudice. Your actions today are an embodiment of the systemic racism that still pervades far too many institutions in this country. You've assumed, based on the color of my skin, that I am someone you can intimidate, someone you can humiliate without consequence." The crowd stood still, hanging on to her every word, while the officers around her exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Hayes continued, her tone unwavering. "You've violated protocol and abused the power granted to you as a law enforcement officer. Instead of upholding the law, you've used it as a weapon against me, someone who serves this very system with honor. You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the institution you represent and the people who place their trust in you to protect and serve." As she spoke, the backup officers, who had been observing the scene closely, began to confirm her identity. Their faces shifted from confusion to realization, their unease palpable as they fully grasped the magnitude of the mistake their colleague had made. Reynolds, once emboldened by his aggressive stance, now found himself cornered, his confidence unraveling. His hands, which had once been poised to pull out his handcuffs, now hung limply by his sides. The very foundation of his actions had been shattered as the truth about Judge Hayes's identity became clear. "Your actions today represent everything that is wrong with our system," Judge Hayes continued, her voice growing stronger. "You perpetuate the cycle of discrimination, and you perpetuate the erosion of trust that the public has in law enforcement. Your job is not to tear people down, but to build a society where respect and fairness prevail." As her words sank in, the crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a resounding show of support. The gathered officers, once unsure of how to handle the confrontation, now found themselves on the side of the law, compelled to stand by Judge Hayes's call for justice and accountability. Reynolds stood frozen, unable to meet the judge's eyes, his pride shattered. The realization of his actions finally hit him, but it was too late. The incident, captured on several smartphones, quickly went viral, sparking widespread outrage. News outlets picked up the footage, and it didn't take long for social media to explode with condemnation of Officer Reynolds's behavior. The public reaction was swift, with people from all walks of life rallying behind Judge Hayes. The video highlighted the aggressive treatment she had endured simply because of her race, and the world was watching as the events unfolded. Within hours, Judge Hayes filed a formal complaint against Officer Reynolds, ensuring that the matter would not go unnoticed. The police department launched an internal investigation into his conduct, with Reynolds placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. It was clear that his actions had crossed a line, and the department could not afford to allow such behavior to go unpunished. But Judge Hayes wasn't content with just seeing Reynolds face consequences. She knew this was bigger than one officer. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. She took to the public stage, delivering a powerful statement about the prevalence of racial profiling and police misconduct. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice resolute and clear. "It is about the countless individuals who face this kind of treatment every day, often without a voice, often without recourse. It is time to address this culture within law enforcement and make the necessary reforms." Her statement resonated deeply with the public. People from across the nation voiced their support for her call to action. Judge Hayes, turning a traumatic personal encounter into a force for change, began a campaign for police reform. She urged for better training, a commitment to anti-racism, and stricter accountability for officers who abuse their power. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. In the following months, she was invited to speak at forums and town halls, advocating for reform at the local, state, and national levels. Through her tireless work, Judge Hayes became an icon of justice and integrity, showing that one act of courage in the face of injustice can spark a movement for lasting change. Officer Reynolds faced immediate consequences after the viral incident. He was placed on suspension, pending a thorough investigation into his actions. Despite his apology during the investigation, many people, including fellow officers and the public, questioned the sincerity of his words. His behavior had been so blatantly discriminatory that it was difficult for anyone to believe that his apology was anything more than a forced attempt to save face. The investigation would ultimately determine his future in law enforcement, but it was clear that his actions had irreparably damaged his credibility and reputation. Judge Hayes, on the other hand, emerged from the incident as a beacon of resilience and justice. Her calm and commanding response in the face of racial profiling turned her into a national symbol of standing up against discrimination. Rather than letting the incident define her, she used it as a springboard to push for long overdue reforms. Her bravery in the face of adversity resonated deeply with people across the country, inspiring many to speak out and take action against systemic racism in law enforcement. Using her platform, Judge Hayes spearheaded several new initiatives aimed at improving police accountability. She advocated for stronger oversight mechanisms to ensure that officers who misbehave or engage in racial profiling are held accountable for their actions. She also worked to build better communication and trust between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. Judge Hayes believed that transparency, along with anti-bias training, was a key to rebuilding that trust. Through her tireless advocacy, Judge Hayes became an influential voice in the movement for justice reform. Her legacy extended far beyond the courtroom, as she became a role model for others who were fighting against discrimination. Her actions showed that even in the face of personal injustice, one can turn the pain of the moment into a force for positive change, inspiring others to take a stand and make their voices heard.